Peeps! It's our last lecture, and it is 20th Century Social Justice Movements. So instead of doing some more wars, the Korean War or the Vietnam War, we're going to talk about social justice movements in America after World War II, where Americans said, we want a bigger piece of the pie. So these are fun because social justice movements are hard work, but the good news about American history is we move slow, and it is perilous, but we always move in the right direction. So for each of these movements, we have increased power sharing for the groups, but we are left in places that are deeply still imperfect, with black civil rights, feminism, indigenous rights, and I don't have a poster for gay rights, but we're going to do that one today too. So, moving in the right direction. We live in a world where we still have to keep moving in that direction. But good news. Yeah? Let's see what's next. First, let's define social justice movement. We think of this as, it can be any number of things, but in general, a social justice movement is any group of people. It can be a specific organization or just a general kind of movement. Like, for example, in America today, the environmental movement doesn't have one dominant group. It's got a whole bunch of small groups and then just people who aren't allied with any group at all. So any movement, any group of people, closely or not closely allied, that seek to redistribute wealth, opportunity, or privileges in society. So more justice for more of the social, more of the society. We've done a little bit of this in our history classes already. The abolition movement, which was the movement to end slavery, black civil rights. We're going to do that some today, and we've been mentioning some of that stuff as we go along. Women's rights, we talked about some of that implicitly in last week's lecture. The American Indian movement. Native Americans have come up occasionally in the class, though I don't know if we've talked about the movement to expand indigenous rights yet, and the Brown or Chicana rights movement. These are all very good examples from the 1960s and 1970s. And then we need to get into the 2000s before we get trans rights, a lot of Asian American rights, and food justice rights, etc., etc. Really, the environmental movement is kind of post-80s, but really gets rolling in the 20th century. Anyway, you get the idea, right? Any movement that seeks to redistribute wealth, opportunity, or privileges in society. Social justice movement. We're going to start with the Black Civil Rights Movement because it is really the granddaddy or the grandparent of all of the 20th century social justice movements. 20th century means the 1900s, so that the Black Civil Rights Movement really is a movement of we think about these things as all kind of the 60s and 70s, but the Black Civil Rights Movement does some significant work in the 1950s. We think of the 1950s as all about Leave It to the Beaver and white people in suburbs, but that's not true, though it's a thing I think American history textbooks want you to think is true. Anyway, what happens is, in 1954, a U.S. Supreme Court Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, ended officially public school segregation. Now, did it really end public school segregation? No, I think public schools are still segregated. It's just a product of neighborhoods and socioeconomic class. My kid, for example, went to high school at Carter High in Fontana. Fantastic high school. But set in a very brown and black district with not a lot of white or Asian kids. So the white kids are over at Claremont High or Upland High. So those high schools are segregated, not officially, not like white kids can't go here or black kids can't go there, but by the reality that people, one, tend to cluster together with groups they're familiar with, and two, because some of this stuff is socioeconomic. Anyway, Brown v. Board of Education says you can no longer have school district rules that say this kid can't go to this school if they're in the district. And then we play through that with the Little Rock nine students who attempted and eventually did enroll in the Little Rock High School in Arkansas. Um, so the big events of the 1950s is this Little Rock segregation struggle, and then the Montgomery bus boycott, which we're going to look at next. Okay, so we'll come back to the Little Rock Nine. So we're going to begin with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 1956. This is super famous. That woman there in the foreground is Rosa Parks. And we have a few famous black American women in the world, I guess. Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Michelle Obama, Oprah. Maybe some of your pop music singers that I don't know. Beyonce, I guess. I don't know. I probably shouldn't start guessing that stuff, right? Anyway, the story that we often tell about the bus boycott is one that makes Rosa Parks a hero, but an accidental hero. That is, one day, a poor, tired, overworked black woman sat down on a bus, and then she was so tired she refused to give up her seat to a white man. And then spontaneously, a bus boycott arose from that, and the segregated and racist bus system in Montgomery, Alabama, was defeated, and black Montgomery Alabamians won, and everyone lived happily ever after. You can see the obvious holes in that story, can't you? But one of the things it does is it doesn't create any agency for the black Americans, the black Alabamians who made this happen. And it turns the one hero of the story, Rosa Parks, into an accidental hero. So, pretty bad story. All historical things taken in context. Oh, here's the thing I do all the time. Here's the slide that says the stuff I just said. Anyway, we can recount real quick. That is, the story makes Rosa Parks an accidental hero. It suggests that the boycott was spontaneous. And then here's the part of the story I didn't say in the previous slide. It often frames Martin Luther King Jr., America's one favorite, at least, American black male hero, as the hero that he swooped in and somehow saved the day. And I'm not dissing Martin Luther King Jr. because why would I do that? But that's not the story, or it's not the story, period, and it's certainly not all of the story. One of the really important people that the story leaves out is Jo Ann Robinson. And it's what Jo Ann Robinson, not just who she is, but what she did. It's a key part of the story, and it is a thing worth telling, and I like putting Jo Ann back in history, because it's like history only had room for one or two famous people in this story, and so it had Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and well, that's it, now we're done. Jo Ann Robinson should be as famous as either one of those. Let's see why. So here's the deal. I'm going to explain to you how the buses in Montgomery really worked. So if you think about Montgomery, Alabama, not unlike any sort of mid-sized city, that you would have the city center where everybody used to live, but then the war and money came, and big highways and public transportation. And what happened is you got white flight. So the white people, white middle class and upper middle class people, would move out to the suburbs. You certainly get that in Los Angeles in the 1950s. And then the city was left to black and brown people. In Alabama, to black people almost entirely. So the notion was here in the buses that the Montgomery city buses not only traveled around the city, but they traveled out to the suburbs and back. And they really carried, as it says here in our first bullet point, two kinds of passengers. White men who were moving from the suburbs where they lived into town where they worked, and black women who were moving from the city where they lived to the suburbs where they worked. And you would have people going, the black women going out in the morning, and the white men going in, and then you would reverse that in the evening. So really two groups of people on the bus. Black women, white men. And if you're asking why were the white men on the bus, because this was in America where middle class people had one car. And the notion was at the time that you left the car at home for the wife, and then she used the car to go to the grocery store, run errands, drop off children, do all that kind of stuff, and that the man could take the bus. We would eventually cars, the the relative price of cars would come down, relative wages would go up, and middle class families would have two cars. But in the beginning, they had one car. And indeed, if you look at car advertisements in the 1950s, you'll see they're very much marketed at women because there's a notion that you bought a car for the family, but really mostly the wife drove it. Anyway, so the deal there is, if we go back to our bullet points, is that black women aren't on the bus for fun. You can't say the buses are segregated and that's unfair, so we should boycott them and cost the city of Montgomery a bunch of money until they desegregate the buses, because black women are on the bus because they need to get to work. And they can't just not go to work. They're going out to the suburbs to be what? They were going out to the suburbs to be nannies, cooks, and maids. Nobody does that shit for free. And nobody does it for fun, because none of those jobs are fun. People do it because they need the work, and they're not qualified to do anything else for all sorts of perfectly acceptable cultural reasons. Segregated schools, keeping black people out of college, etc., etc. So Joanne Robinson, she was educated. She came from a fairly well-to-do family, educated black woman, and she worked. She was a professor at this local, what you would call it, we would call it community college, but they didn't call it that, but an all-black 2-year college. And she thought she and the NAACP, which was the local civil rights organization for black people, it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. The NAACP still exists. We don't say colored persons anymore, though we do see people of color, but nonetheless. Joanne Robinson is a member of the NAACP, so is Rosa Parks. And Joanne Robinson and some others, but she leads this group, recognize that you can't just ask women to stay off the buses. So what she does is she turns her office into kind of boycott central. She gets a big chalkboard on wheels it into her office, and they put up a big chart on it. And the notion is that they use the chart weekly to create a carpool, a big carpool system to get maids, nurses, yeah, I suppose some nurses, nannies, cooks out to the suburbs to do their job, and then from the suburbs back to their house in the evening, where they had to do their second unwaged job, feed their families, keep their houses clean. And so carpools need two things: riders, okay, that's fairly easy if you're going to boycott the bus, and two, drivers, and that's harder because all of these working class women are on the bus because they don't have cars. Well, who has cars? White middle class women, and a small number of black middle class women, because there's always a black middle class. It's just small. So Joanne Robinson contacts people that she knows would be sympathetic, because not everybody is a racist. Not all of the white people are racist. Not all Southerners are racist. You get my point? I'm not saying they aren't all. I'm not saying there aren't any of them. I'm not saying they aren't all. So she gets women, black and white, who have access to cars to volunteer to ride, to be carpool drivers. At that moment, then, you've got a thing. And you can say, okay, we got a system to get these people to work. Let's have a boycott. So let's see what happens next. So now the Rosa Parks part of the story. The thing is, I wasn't saying at the beginning that Rosa Parks wasn't a hero. It's just that the story often portrays her as an accidental hero. But in reality, Rosa Parks didn't just decide one day to not give up her seat to a white man because she was tired. And by the way, let's talk about that for just a second. There was, and maybe still is in America, but I know for certainly there was this sort of standard that a man never sat while a woman was standing, and that men with both, one, waited till women sat before they sat, and two, if they were sitting and a woman came in the room, you stood up, and if there wasn't a seat, you gave her yours. Now, I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I'm a big fan of equality. But those were sort of the social nicety rules. So the thing about the bus seats is it isn't just about segregation. You can't sit there. But the rule was on the bus that if a black person, including a black woman, was sitting and a white person got on the bus, even a man, that black person had to stand up and give their seat to the white person. And so what you have here with black women being asked to give up their seats to white men is a subversion of the social rules and a kind of subtle, not kind of, a fully and not subtle, a message that said black women aren't real women, that they don't deserve the same rules of polite society as white women. Therefore, it is okay if they stand while a white man sits. So that's part of the thing about the buses. It's not just that they were segregated, is that there was a racial sexist thing going on there. So Rosa was a member of the local NAACP, which we mentioned is the oldest black civil rights organization in the nation. And she'd been going to meetings, and then she was an officer in that organization, and she went to some conventions, as it were, and she learned about passive resistance. How do we resist without, being violent? And she learned about boycotts, because boycotts are a passive resistance. They are saying, well, it's not that we're going to burn your store down or throw rocks. We're just not going to buy your product. Boycotts are an effective way to move capitalist forces, because there's nothing. Capitalism will give in on racism, sexism, and homophobia if there's money to be made in giving in on it. So she learned all these techniques, and so she volunteered. She said, I will be the one. And they needed what they needed. They tried with another woman the year before, but her record wasn't spotless. So when she refused to give up her seat, the press portrayed her as a bad girl who was once again not behaving the rules, whereas Rosa Parks was sort of legally and socially spotless. Now, is this fair? No. Is it the world? Sadly, yes. So Rosa Parks says, there's nothing, they can't portray me as a bad woman. For the only thing that I've done is not give up my seat to a white man. So Rosa she's been riding the buses, but what she's doing is she's riding the buses now. Joanne Robinson's got the boycott carpools all ready to go, and Rosa's now in the bus waiting for the time when somebody says, ma'am, stand up so I can sit down in your seat, so she can say no. So that day finally comes. The bus driver and the white man who doesn't get her seat are both offended. The bus driver pulls over the bus. The police are summoned, and she is arrested for breaking the rules. And she did it on purpose. She's a thoughtful and careful social resistance organizer who had a plan and enacted her plan. And she knew exactly what was going to happen to her, and she did it anyway. That she was going to get booked, that she was going to go to jail, and that lots and lots of white Alabamians were not going to like her. She's not an accidental hero. She's an on-purpose hero. The other heroes in this boycott is, you can have Joanne Robinson, who plans the carpools, and Rosa Parks, who refuses to give up her seat and sparks the whole thing, but you still have to have all the people. This is the thing about social resistance. You can have a leader or leaders, but you still need the people who are nameless and the people for whom history doesn't record. But you need all those people. Social justice movements are always about masses of people because, like I said before, it's the one thing we've got. We don't have economic power because we're not rich. We don't run the politics or the banks or the corporations. What we have is numbers. So you needed black people in Montgomery to say, I'm not riding the bus. And I will either avail myself to carpools or I will walk to work instead, and it will take me longer and it will be more exhausting. And trust me, I am black, so my job is already exhausting. Or I will hitchhike. But it's not quite hitchhiking, because in a city that was on a bus boycott, if someone like this woman in the top picture stood on the street and held out her hand, if you were sympathetic, black or white, you could pull over and help her. So there's also those heroes too. Where do you need to go? I can get you there. Hey, when do you get off? Maybe I'll swing by and pick you up. Oh, I hadn't heard about Joanne Robinson. I'd like to volunteer for that. And admittedly, most of these pictures are all of black people because I don't want you to think that I'm trying to make this astounding moment in black resistance in American history be about white people, because I am not that person. But but that there was some white cooperation that made this thing work. And I like to recognize that, not because I'm being defensive about white people, because I think in America we always think the lines are drawn by color, and they're really not. I mean, they are in a way. God, I don't want to be offensive or stupid. Um, but that there are always people who are sympathetic to a movement, and then people who should theoretically belong to the movement who aren't sympathetic. There are, for example, in America, black Trump supporters. Don't ask me, but they exist, right? So it is a biracial and bi-gendered resistance, but it is mostly black people and really mostly black women, which is one of the really cool things about it that they also don't tell you. About 9 months into the protest, Martin Luther King, who was a famous, or just starting to get famous then, hears about the protest, comes to town, stages a march. It gets a lot of press. But the city of Montgomery, the boycott had been going on for 9, 10 months at that juncture, and the city of Montgomery was hemorrhaging money because they owned the bus system, and the bus system was losing money every day they ran the empty buses. And after a year, the city of Montgomery, their bus system nearly bankrupt, the city of Montgomery said, we give up. We will desegregate the buses. And then black Americans went back to riding the bus, and white Americans who had also boycotted went back to riding the bus, and everybody rode the bus. And am I telling you that it was everyone lived happily ever after in Montgomery, Alabama after that? I am not telling you that. It's a small step in the right direction. Small step led by a few people and pushed by lots and lots of people whose names we will never know. And that is the beauty. Okay, so back to the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine is about school integration, and not just in Little Rock, Kansas, but in the United States of America. So again, the Brown v. Board of Education is a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson, as it says there, is an 1896 Supreme Court case that said you could segregate schools as long as it was separate but equal. But I'm here to tell you, and I think any of you who went to school in poor school districts can tell you, there's no such thing as separate but equal. When we separate people out because we want the boys and girls separate, or the white people separate from the brown and black people, when we do that on purpose, and we do it so that we can privilege one group, usually the white people or the male people, and disempower the other group, right? So there's no such thing as separate equal, but that was the fiction upon which the American educational system operated for a number of decades. Brown v. Board of Education comes along and says, yeah, that's not cool, but it's one thing to pass the law, and it's another thing to enforce the law. So what we're going to talk about next is, how do we get the law enforced? Interestingly, the school district in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the town, the school district said, we're going to desegregate the schools. A bunch of angry black parents didn't show up at the school board and force them to. The school district decided on their own. But they said it'd be voluntary. So in the fall of 1957, 9 black teenagers, along with their parents, I'm sure, decided that they would enroll in what had traditionally been the all-white Little Rock High School, thus breaking decades-long school segregation in Little Rock, Arkansas. Governor Orville Faubus, who just sounds like a racist, right? Orville Faubus? What the hell? You can just see him. He seems piggy. He's in a Colonel Sanders suit. Orville Faubus. He is every bit as repugnant human being as he sounds like. His name makes him sound like. Which isn't fair, but nobody said it was going to be fair. Anyway, the racists in Little Rock get hold of the news that 9 children, black children, will be attending Little Rock School, and they come unglued. Just sure, these 9 children will pollute their lily white kids and I guess ruin their lives. All the usual racist nonsense stuff I do not want to articulate here, but you know what it sounds like because you've heard it. And so Falbus says those 9 children are not coming to school here, so he uses the local National Guard to block the school and to keep black children out of the school. He used the National Guard, the army, men in uniforms with guns to keep children out of school. What the fuck's wrong with you? President Eisenhower, who was no fan of integration, but nonetheless was a president in the old school who said the law is the law, and whether I like it or not, it's still the law. Eisenhower said, you can't use the National Guard, the Army, to break the law. The law says that schools are desegregated, and you've done just that. You've used the Army to break the law. That's the illegal thing. Dude, shut up and sit down. And Eisenhower essentially orders the National Guard to turn around and to escort the children into school and to protect them when they come and go. This takes a few weeks, this wrestling back and forth. It gets a lot of national attention. America lines up on one side or another. People are pretty hysterical about it, as you might imagine. In retrospect, it seems really ridiculous. Like we integrated the schools and nothing happened. And indeed, I think kids' school experiences are richer. That you were a generation of people, for example, who all went to very diverse schools, and it made you better for it. My kid went to an extremely diverse school, and it was so good for her. It was way better than if she'd have gone to high school in someplace lily white, or I'd have sent her off to private school where she'd have never had contact with kids less privileged than her. It seems ridiculous in retrospect, but in the 1950s, it seemed like a thing worth getting really upset about. I show you these 2 pictures just to get you a sense of how upsetting it would have been. The top one, obviously, children, literally children, being escorted into school by men in uniforms with guns. And yeah, they got them into the school, but is that how any child in America should go to school? I think not. I think not. And the lower picture is super famous. It's a 16-year-old black woman, child, because 16-year-olds are children, don't want to insult anyone, but legally, children, walking to school, and there's a crowd of angry white people just screaming at her. I'm just trying to imagine a world where, as a grown-up, I would go somewhere and scream at other people's children. And I don't think I wouldn't do it just because I'm not a racist. I think I wouldn't do it because it's a terrible thing to do. Yell at children? What? I mean, what? Years later, when my kid was a baby and I was spending a lot of time watching TV because I was breastfeeding her, I was watching Oprah in the afternoons, and there was a reunion show where that woman right behind the young black woman's shoulder, and the young black woman who was no longer young, they had a reunion and the white woman apologized, and I watched it and thought, I don't fucking care. I don't care that you apologized. I don't care that you regret what you did. I mean, that's nice, but you still did it. And that person and all the kids in America that had to go through that stuff too, you have to carry that stuff around with you, whether people apologize or not. I'm not a big fan of apologies. I think they're bullshit. How about just don't do the shitty thing to start with, right? Right. Oh, so here's the stuff I kind of already said. Well, some of it. So Eisenhower orders the federal troops back into Little Rock. They get the kids in the school. So that's 1957. In the fall of 1958, Falbus said, if we have to have integrated schools in Little Rock, we're just not going to have school. So he closed all the public schools. And once again, Eisenhower said, you can't do that. You can't close public schools. So the U.S. Supreme Court, the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, you fat racist, you have to open the schools back up. And so it was done, and yet it wasn't done. I mean, you can't imagine that once the schools opened back up, that it was all delightful. And you can't imagine that there was nothing braver than the 9 kids the first year and the small handful of kids after that who volunteered as black young adults to go to this white school and to be perhaps befriended by some of the kids, but hated by others because their parents were haters too, and that's where we learn that stuff, right? It's a pretty impressive and pretty sad story, but it does lead us eventually to the world we have now, where we don't think much of that. Something. I I I think I'm the only white professor in my department whose kid went to public school, and they'll always have all these professors, all these bullshit excuses for why they send their kids to private school. But if you ask me, if you're white and you send your kids to private schools, it's because you don't want them going to the local public school because there's too many black and brown kids there. Um, that's what I think. I'm a cranky old broad, though. Anyway, the fight goes on. Well, there we are, whipping right through our topics. Here we're going to do a tiny, tiny slice of the second wave feminist movement. The first wave feminist movement we briefly covered with the film right after the midterm. We watched Iron Jawed Angels, which was about the suffrage movement, or the last like maybe 10 years. Really, that's about the last 3 years, that film. But sort of the final push to get women the right to vote, thus expanding the vote in a larger segment of American population than ever before. That's the first wave feminism. That move to get women the vote starts in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention and finishes in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Kind of. You can't really say a movement ever really finishes, but it did accomplish its goal. Then they started on new goals. We get things. What happens is in World War II, as we learned, is that women get a lot of new opportunities, and then they're told to go home, and they're unwilling to do so, and then they're unhappy with the way society treats them, and so then we get in the mid 60s into the late 70s, and then really ramping up in the 70s and 80s, the second wave feminist movement. I think right now we're in the third wave feminist movement. I don't think I know. I lecture about that in my women's history class, but this is not that class. This is another entirely delightful class. So anyway, the second wave feminist movement. We can kind of argue about when it starts, and we don't want to, but some people say it started with the invention of the pill, the contraceptive pill in 1962, the first time in human history that women could, with fairly high certainty, control their fertility, which then changes everything. If you control when you have a baby, you can control your education, you can control your marital choices, you can control your career. That is, you can have the kind of control over your life that men have if you can control your fertility. And if you don't have control over your fertility with both birth control and abortion, then you don't have the kind of choices men have, which is, of course, why some men don't want us to have those choices. Other people say that the second wave feminist movement began with Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. There's a long lecture about that, but the short term is that it's a book. A lot of middle-class white ladies read it. Betty Friedan talked about the problem that has no name. That's what she called it. Quote, the problem that has no name, end quote, which was the problem that when American women were told that we should be happy. We had suburban houses, we had cars, we had husbands, we had kids, we had soccer practice, we had dishwashers and vacuum cleaners. We had all that stuff, and still we weren't happy. What was the problem? And society told us that as women we were fulfilled, and we weren't fulfilled, because it turns out not everybody wants to be a full-time housewife. Full-time housewife and mother. Some people do. Good for them. Some people don't. I certainly didn't. And other people say that the movement started in 1968 with the Miss America protest. I'm not sure which of these is correct, but I know that I'm very, very fond of the 1968 Miss America protest, so that's the one we're going to look at next. So the Miss America pageant goes way back to the 1920s. I used to, long, long ago, I had This is how old it was. I had a VHS that was a kind of a documentary about the history of the Miss America pageant. I used to show it in class, back. You had TVs on carts with VCR machines in the room. Man, that's some OG stuff. Anyway, the pageant goes way back to the 20s. By the 1960s, the Miss America pageant, I heard for a while that it was not on TV or it was on some obscure site, and then I heard that they canceled it, but then it was brought back. There's ongoing problems with these pageants. I think all you need to know about pageants, from my perspective, is the ex-president rapists love them, which tells you they're suspect. On the other hand, a lot of women find participation in pageants to be affirming and empowering, and they certainly do give out scholarships. So I don't want to stand in judgment. But in 1968, some young women did want to stand in judgment. Their notion was that these pageants were just cattle calls where men judged women's bodies, and it creates a world where we're all held to the same beauty standard of slimness and white facial structure and certain kinds of hairdo, and we're all judged by our size and not by our accomplishments. And so there was plenty there to protest. The group that organized the protest was a group called the New York Radical Women, headed up by a young woman named Robin Morgan, who's still around out there doing all sorts of fantastic stuff. But there we have it. Let's go see what's next. So these young women from New York, they go down to New Jersey, and they organize this protest. And there's not a ton of them. They put up some pamphlets. This is before social media. With social media, you probably could have got hundreds and hundreds of young women to a thing like this. But they put up some flyers in New York City, and they got a handful of women, 30, 40 women, to go down and to stage a protest outside of the hall that was holding the pageant. And their protest was, this is what's interesting about feminism, is it's not just about rights for women ever. It's always a multi-layered approach to social inequality, which is why I am so proud to call myself a feminist. Let's see the many things it was about. First, and I think most obviously, is they were protesting the objectification of women. And objectification, I think that's a word that gets thrown around a lot. If you think about it, it's a word that essentially means the turning women into objects. Objectification. And then there's the more nuanced thing, which is sort of about the male gaze and about us lining up and competing with each other for the male gaze, and about conformity. If you look at that line of women there, they're all pretty much the same. And then there's the poster on the right is really famous. One of the young women brought this poster that essentially compared a naked female body, shock and dismay, to a piece of cattle, and sort of a notion that we were like it was like a fair, and we were being judged by prize cows. So that it's a fair comparison. So they're protesting the objectification of women in beauty pageants. They also object to the racism inherent in the Miss America pageants, because only in 1968 only white women were allowed to enter the pageants. Later on, they would let quote unquote black women into the pageants, but they pretty much had to, and still do, conform to white beauty standards. So the very first black woman to win a Miss America pageant was Vanessa Williams, and she was almost predictably, and I'm not hard-ass on Vanessa Williams, actually a big fan, but predictably light-skinned, very sort of white facial features, the tiny nose and the perfectly shaped white lady lips and long silky hair. Not that there's anything wrong with that. No shaming anybody. But certainly the women protesting in 68 were protesting both the fact that the pageant was all white, and thus was white supremacist and racist ipso facto, and also that it judged women on a very narrow beauty standard that was mostly about whiteness. It's also about class, et cetera, et cetera. And then they got together with another group of young women, all of them black, who organized a Black Miss America, Miss Black America. That same night, they held it across the way. It was much smaller. Held it not far, like across the street and down a few buildings from the Miss America pageant. And the notion was, it's the classic "Black is beautiful." That if we're going to judge women and how they look, could we be more open about what counts as beauty? And indeed, the big, it doesn't seem shocking to us now, but it was then, thing was that they picked as the winner this woman with natural hair. That is, her hair hadn't been permed and straightened into the approximation of white lady hair. She was wearing an afro, and still very beautiful. So there's another thing the protest was about. The Miss America protest was also an anti-war protest. That is, the Miss America, the pageant, was in it was supportive of the Vietnam War, and sent whoever won the Miss America pageant would be sent overseas to Vietnam to entertain the troops in Vietnam. And the Vietnam War was really controversial amongst Americans. It's classic American imperialism. Why the hell were we in Vietnam, bombing the holy shit out of the Vietnamese? There's answers to that, but none of them are good. But anyway, so very much part of what the Miss America pageant protest was an anti-war protest. This picture I'm showing you here is not from the Miss America protest. This is a bunch of women in front of Congress. It was a group of women called Mothers Against the War. And so oftentimes if you were not for the Vietnam War, conservatives would call you hippies or communists. You know, the usual things that conservatives do with liberals and progressives. And so a bunch of mothers of dead soldiers showed up to protest the war, and it was harder to call them names. So that picture you're seeing is something else, but it's all tied together. And last but certainly not least, the Miss America protest was protesting. The protest was protesting the way Miss America promoted consumer culture. That it sold a bunch of commercials that were very much about beauty products, and very much this notion, and you still get this in America today. God, I see it on TikTok all the time, and I scroll past it, but I think about the damage that does to young women. All these ads that say essentially, buy this, do this, use that, and you will be beautiful. You will be thin. You won't have wrinkles. Boys will like you. Whatever the thing is. Miss America was the pageant was funded by there was a hairspray company, a company that made hair dye, and a shampoo company. I can't remember what else. Doesn't really matter. But the notion was that they were protesting both those things and just all the stuff that women are supposed to buy, that, you know, so that we can be women. And so they had this freedom trash can, and they were throwing things into it. So they threw like magazines that promoted that stuff, like Cosmopolitan or whatever those magazines that show up in doctors' offices are. They were throwing those in there. They were throwing hair curlers in there. They were throwing high heels in there, and they were throwing brassieres in the freedom trash can. They did not set the freedom trash can on fire, but the media reported that they did, and so this is where you got this sort of notion that feminists were bra burners. And indeed, like when I was a young feminist in the 90s, you'd still hear that. It's probably unfamiliar to you, but this sort of notion that feminists were bra burners, as if there was something terribly wrong, as if burning one's bra was the equivalent of burning a flag. Oh no. And I don't really object to either one of those things because, you know, First Amendment. But I don't think the First Amendment covers bras. But also, here's what every woman listening to this knows. Nobody's going to set fire to a good bra, and bad bras should be burned. But anyway, they're protesting consumer culture. All right, next. After the Miss America protest and a brief foray into second wave feminism, let's take a peek at the American Indian movement and the occupation of Alcatraz. 1969 to 1971. They occupied indigenous peoples, Indians as they called themselves, occupied Alcatraz from 1969 to 71. Alcatraz had been, and I'm sure you know this, a very famous prison on a tiny island in the San Francisco Bay. But back in the 60s, the federal government had abandoned it. Before it had been abandoned, it had been indigenous people's land. So before white people showed up in California, it belonged to the indigenous people. The white people showed up. Eventually, they put a prison on it. And so it belonged to the federal government, but then the federal government abandoned it. So it's sitting out there. Okay? Yeah. So some college-educated Native American people said, "Hey, I found a loophole." In 1868, at the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the United States government signed a treaty with the Native Americans that said that, yeah, we're going to take your land. As the U.S. government, we're going to take your land. But if we ever decide that we don't want it and we abandon it, you can have it back. Sounds like a bullshit treaty, and it pretty much was. Except some smart pre-law student in the American Indian movement said, "Ha! I found this law. And the American federal government has abandoned Alcatraz. So we could, claim it legally." So smart. So a group of young activists in San Francisco get together and they make this plan. They get a bunch of people together. They've got families, women, children, men, the whole schlemiel and schlemazel. And the idea, they pack food, they pack sleeping bags, they pack, kerosene and lanterns and flashlights, all the stuff you'd need for camping, because they're going out to take over an abandoned prison, which is, a notoriously unlovely place. So they go out there in the November of 69, 79 people, and they claim Alcatraz for themselves. And they get an immense amount of press for it. And the smart thing about it is, claiming Alcatraz in and of itself probably didn't do much for Native Americans around the country. It did get Native Americans an immense amount of press, so people could stand in front of the camera and say, "Here's our problems. We're undereducated. We have trouble accessing education because of the reservations. We tend to be poor. We are abused in the courts and in the judicial system in all of these ways, etc., etc." It was the occupation of Alcatraz creates this immense stage upon which a myriad of Native people can talk about their issues. Astoundingly and amazingly, they stayed out there for 2 years. The original 79, the numbers would shift. I think most people couldn't just stay in a place for 2 years. They had to go back and teach their job, or the kids had to go to school. They did set up a school at Alcatraz and educated the kids there. But it was a shifting group of people out there at Alcatraz, but there was always a significant group of people out there, and they continued to call attention to Native American issues with poverty, healthcare, and education. I love this picture. It says, "Indians welcome Indians." This is Indian land, and they're playing basketball. I grew up in Montana, and we have a bunch of reservations in Montana with little tiny towns on it, with these thus then correspondingly small schools. They had like the big high school. I went to a high school in the capital of Montana, so it was a triple A high school. Then there was single A, double A, single A. It's just like baseball. Then there was Class B and Class C, and Class C were the very smallest schools, and most of the reservation schools were Class C schools. And Class C schools are tiny, tiny, so they couldn't field a football team ever because they would not have enough kids. But they could field a basketball team. Also, a lot of them were in places where the winter was just too awful for football, but you can always play basketball inside. So Native Americans in Montana tended to have fantastic basketball teams. Like, I've always been surprised there weren't more Native Americans in professional basketball, because That Class C tournament used to be in Helena, Montana, and these little tiny Native American schools would show up with these basketball teams with just barely enough guys or girls to field a team, and then they would just clean up. So I think I picked that basketball picture because that's like a part of the indigenous experience that I recognize. All right. What's interesting about the occupation of Alcatraz is nothing terrible or calamitous ever happens. There's no there's no violence. There's no riot. They occupy it. They get their word out. They publish some books. They talk to the press, and then eventually, after 2 years, they're like, it's cold and it's icky out here. I think we've done the job, and they go home. But they've gotten the ball rolling, and there's still in America today a very vigorous indigenous rights social justice movement, all sorts of groups working in different places with different tribal members doing all the sorts of things that one would think. I don't want to burn a lot more time on it here, but you could certainly Google that. The last social justice movement we're going to do is the beginning of the gay rights movement with the Stonewall riots. Now, here's the thing. I just said the beginning of the gay rights movement, and I don't want you to think that suddenly in 1969 non-heterosexual people discovered they were oppressed and decided to do something about it. If you do the history of gay and lesbian Americans, you can find all sorts of resistance to oppression going back to the 1920s. But what you get here with the Stonewall riot in the spring of '69 is a kind of a catalyst moment in the way, for example, that the marches in Ferguson were a catalyst moment for the Black Lives Matter movement. The Stonewall riot is that kind of thing. So the Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in New York City. They got routinely harassed by the police. I have a friend, his name is Jerry. He was a New Yorker, and he went to the Stonewall, and he was actually there the night of the riot. And he says it wasn't just one night, it was multiple nights. The police would come in, and they would harass the patrons. He said that the issue was both that the New York policemen didn't like gay bars, but that their larger problem was that bar owners used to pay off the police. That is, once a month you would give the police some sum of money, and then the police would stay out of your bar and ignore whatever was going on in there. And the guy that owned the Stonewall wouldn't do it. He was like, I'm not paying you to do your job. My taxes already pay for that job. And if you really poke the history of the Stonewall, you'll find that stuff. But on the surface of it, all you'll find is that cops were harassing the bar, and finally the gay guys had enough. There was a scuffle. It spilled out into the streets. And then it turns into a multi-night kind of scuffle between gay men and the New York City police. And again, it's very different from Alcatraz or the Miss America protest, but it's also similar in that what it does is it's kind of like the time when the moment a movement's time has come, and then something happens that shines the light on that moment. And the Stonewall riot is that. It's considered the foundation moment of the gay liberation era. Jerry says, I put these pictures up, and I was one time, we're on the same Renaissance Fair group, the Fools Guild. We're all in the Fools Guild, and Jerry's an old fool, and I'm a less old fool. But Jerry says that they discovered on the second night that it takes exactly 6 guys to tip over a police car, because 4 guys and you couldn't get the car rocking enough to tip it over, and more than 6 guys, there wasn't room to get everybody's hands really on the car to push, but 6 was the exact number you needed so that you could tip a police car on its side. Okay, I'm not telling you that tipping police cars on their side is a good idea, but I also think if the police are hassling you, you gotta do what you gotta do. I just like the story. I was like, really? I never knew how many people it took to tip over a police car. But anyway, uh, what you get with the Stonewall riot then is decades long uh, 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 queer movement, and I think it's I think it's safe to say it is probably the most successful social justice movement in America of the late 20th and early 21st century. That great strides have been taken, and public opinion has been changed, despite all the noise that conservatives make. Um, I've got lots of gay married friends, which is very cool, and people who are perfectly comfortable just being openly gay. My sister, I was just in Oklahoma visiting my sister, and she and her husband are very conservative. They've got like MAGA stickers on their cars, but their daughter's fiance's sister is gay, and then the sister and the girlfriend come over to the house, and they sit on the sofa together and they snuggle, and my sister's like, aren't they cute? So even these really conservative MAGA people are like, look at these cute lesbians. I don't know. I don't know what to do with that story. But to say again, a successful movement because those girls are safe even in a conservative household. That's good news. All right, we could go on and on with the parade of social justice movements, but I think you got the idea. I did not do the Chicano or the Latinx movement. I didn't do. You don't have. There is a nascent movement with Cesar Chavez and some ladies, but and that you don't get much Asian American or Muslim American social justice movements. There's a there's a burgeoning environmental rights movement, but I didn't do that. There's a bunch. Just because I didn't do it doesn't mean it's important. I gave you some highlights of some stuff I thought you might think was important. We did some representation, and we can't cover everything again in History 1 because there's just no way. Um, what's interesting about all of those movements is it's not like they had a moment and then it was over. They're all ongoing. All the ones I didn't talk about are ongoing, so that we have here at this very second in the 21st century, in a post-pandemic world, we have all of these social justice movements. We've got that. There's the list. I don't need to read it. You're smart people. You can read. That however terrible the world can seem some days, particularly if you accidentally catch the news, there's a lot of people pushing back, and we make gradual progress towards expanding equality in America. It's very gradual, but it is progress, but only when we fight. I love this quote by Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was a very famous cultural anthropologist who is long dead. But she said, and you may have heard this before, but never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And she's right. Of course she's right. She's famous. Small groups of committed, regular human beings can change the world. We're the only thing that changes the world. The status quo doesn't change the world. 1%'s not going to change the world. Small groups of citizens, small groups of people just like you and me, we change the world. The generation coming up right now is going to change the world in astounding ways because there's a whole field of stuff that you just can't get worked up about. You can't get worked up about you're just cool about so many things. But anyway, I want you to keep in mind that we're not powerless, and that all of the significant changes that have happened in America happened because of just small groups of regular people got together. Not famous people, not rich people, not powerful people, just people who were brave, people who took a shot in the dark to make the world a better place. And if they could do it, we could all do it. So endeth your last lecture. That's it. Next week is movie week, and the week after that is finals week. Look what you did. You got there. Go you. Yeah. I hope these lectures have inspired you. I hope these lectures have empowered you. I hope that in knowing more, you feel stronger and clearer about who you are and what your values are. hope all those things. Anyway, good job. That's enough of that. See you later. I miss you already.